Welcome to session 3 of our class on Biblical Worldview 1. We are still in the introduction chapter to, or the introduction section to Living God's Word. And we're down to page 17 and the heading Crumbling of the Kingdom. Again, just to put everything in context, this is basically the outline of the book that is followed, or the outline that is followed in the book to tell, as they say, the story of God and humanity. The humanity's falling away and God's continuing attempts to get humanity to turn back to Him. He has, from the very beginning, actually from before the beginning, has laid out a plan to reunite mankind in fellowship with Him. And it's pretty clear that only a portion of mankind is going to heed that call, heed those attempts that God makes to get back into fellowship with His creation, as far as humankind is concerned. So, we have discussed the previous sections of this, and we'll go into a whole lot more detail, obviously, as we go through the chapters that cover these things specifically. But after Solomon dies, our authors say on page 17 that the nation has a civil war and splits into two: Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. I don't know why they say that there was a civil war, because at least at this point, at the split of the kingdom in 1 Kings chapter 11, beginning with verse well, I had it a while ago. Now I've lost it. Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm sorry. Verse 21, beginning, it says, "Now when Rehoboam had come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen men who were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah the man of God, saying, Speak to Rehoboam the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, saying, Thus says the Lord, you must not go up and fight against your relatives, the sons of Israel. Return every man to his house, for this thing has come from me." So they listened to the word of the Lord and returned and went their way according to the word of the Lord. And then it goes on where Jeroboam sets up idolatrous idols, or sets up idolatry in the form of 2 golden calves at Bethel and Dan. And then, the history continues, but the idea is that I don't know why our authors place in their text, again on page 17, under Crumbling of the Kingdom, that there was a civil war, because God specifically forbade a war against the north. And as they point out, the northern kingdom, which is at this point known as Israel, the southern kingdom known as Judah, The northern kingdom never has a good king. Okay? The southern kingdom has mostly bad kings, but there were a few that came along that were good, that they obeyed God. But as they point out, these good kings were unable to stop the downward slide into idolatry. The prophets, according to God's direction, prophesied during this time, always calling the people back to what God wanted, what he had said in his law. And probably when we get to the section on prophets, which will be chapter 8. When we get there, we'll go into more detail about it here. But the fact is that a lot of people misunderstand the prophets and exactly what their job was. Probably only about 10% of what they did dealt with the future. That is to say, when people think of prophets, they think of prophecy and therefore telling about the future. But the fact is that all prophecy is not telling about the future. Basically, the prophets, except for that 10% that they dealt with, basically they were preachers. Preachers who encouraged the people to return to God, warned the people that they should turn to God, told them about the punishments that would come upon them if they did not obey God. And again, this is all pointed out, or this is all things that had been said prior to this in the law of Moses. I think it was last week that we talked about Deuteronomy 28 being one of those places. I say last week, in the last couple of sessions. As I record these sessions, sometimes they're a week apart. But the idea is that prophets were mainly preachers. And as it says here in this first paragraph, the prophets warn that if Israel and Judah do not turn back to God, terrible judgment will come and they will be driven out of the promised land. As we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 28, basically the progression is that the nation is warned by the prophets. Then, if they don't listen, and then some natural disasters are brought against them, such as famine and disease and locusts and so forth. And if they don't listen to that, then God will send other nations to come in and defeat them, punish them, and occupy their land. And if they don't listen to that, then and only then would God take them out of the promised land. And that's exactly what happened. But there was a lot that went before God sending them off into captivity. Well, as we've already pointed out, let me go back and say something about prophets again, and that is, of that 10% of their material that actually had to do with the future, the majority of that had to do with things that would happen in their own time, such as something that was going to happen maybe 24 hours later. such as the time in the Kings, in the books of Kings, where the city of Jerusalem is besieged by, oh no, I'm sorry, it's the city of Samaria is besieged by the Assyrian army, Sennacherib being the king, and or maybe it's the Syrian army. I'm getting my accounts mixed up, but the point is, the one I'm talking about is where there are some lepers who go out. They say, we're without food. There's a famine because the city is surrounded by this army, and they say we're without food, so we're going to die here for sure. So what is it going to harm, or what's going to be the difference if we just go out to the army that's surrounding the city and beg for food? Because if they kill us, then they kill us, because we're going to die here, or we might die there, but we also might get something of what we need. So they go on out, and what has happened is that the prophet of God has told the king and his royal court that by this time tomorrow there's going to be plenty of food. And he illustrates that, or he shows that, by saying that the prices of food are going to drop drastically to almost nothing, okay, because there's going to be a great supply of food. And one of the king's servants, one of his officials, speaks up and says, why, if God were to open the windows of heaven, then, how could this be unless he did open the windows of heaven? And the prophet looks at him and says, you will see it, but you will not take part in it. So in about 24 hours, when the lepers have gone out to see if they can get some food from the the besieging army, then they find that the army has fled and left everything behind. Their food, their clothing, their possessions of all kinds are left. And then they finally go back to the city and tell them, hey, there's the army has left. So the king sends out some folks to check on it, and they find out that it's true, and there's a stampede. Once the news gets out, there's a stampede out the gate of the city to go and take part in this plunder of the enemy camp. Well, in this stampede, in this great press of people going out the gate, the royal official is trampled. And as he falls to the ground, he's able to see the people running out from his, from being on the ground. He's able to see that, but he died and therefore did not take part in the food that would be in ready supply now. So, in that case, the prophet makes a prophecy that happens, within about 24 hours. Other times, they made prophecies that were, 10, 12 years down the road. Other times, they made prophecies like Jeremiah, who made a prophecy about the time that the captives were going to spend in Babylon, that is the southern kingdom, and that was a matter of 70 years of captivity, and Jeremiah prophesies that. So the prophecy doesn't come true until after Jeremiah is dead. And but the point is that the majority of these prophecies happen during the time of the people, or the next generation or so, that when the prophecy was made. So But the fact is that only a very, very small percentage of the prophets or what the prophets said had to do with anything beyond their time, such as the first century, the establishment of the kingdom, that is, the establishment of the church, and all the way down past our time to the final judgment. There are some prophecies that the prophets made in the Old Testament times that have to do with the final judgment. So that's just a quick overview of what it meant to be a prophet and what their job was. Their main job was to call the people back to what God had already said. Well, as they point out in the next paragraph, with few exceptions, no one really listens to the prophets, and thus the tragic judgment they proclaimed unfolds. The northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians in about 622 BC, and they are scattered throughout the nations, with only a very, very few left in northern Israel. And the Sennacherib brings in captives from other nations into the northern kingdom, and it's at this point that the Israelites that were left, the few that were left, intermarried with these other peoples from other nations, and from them came the people known as the Samaritans. And these are the people that Ezra and Nehemiah are going to have such problem with, because the Samaritans at that point consider themselves still to be descendants of Israel, even though they're mixed descendants. And God had said in his law, in the law of Moses, that the Israelites were not supposed to marry outside of their nation. And therefore, these people could not be accepted to help and to be a part of the people who returned and to help rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall and so forth of Jerusalem when that happened. So again, the northern kingdom is destroyed in 622 BC, and there's really nothing left as far as a people known as the kingdom of Israel. Okay? Now, we have evidence in the scriptures that there are still people from the other tribes who who came down to southern Israel, to Judah, when Jeroboam set up his golden calves. Let's go back and find that real quick, because what we're saying is that pretty much all the tribes of Israel, if not all of them, are represented in southern Israel, the tribe of in the kingdom of Judah, because when Jeroboam set up his golden calves, those who were faithful, those who knew that this was a bad idea, left northern Judah or northern Israel and came down to live in southern Israel, that is, in Judah. I'm not seeing the passage real quick, but let me try one more time to see where it is. Well, evidently it's not coming up too quick here, so I guess you'll just have to take my word for it. Um, but the point is that uh, you know the tribes of Israel are not completely wiped out uh, at this point when the northern kingdom is taken. But then later, the southern kingdom did not listen to the prophets either, and the Babylonians came against the southern kingdom and took captives on three different occasions. In 605 is the first time Nebuchadnezzar came against Judah and Jerusalem and took captives back to Babylon. The next time he did it was in about 597 BC. And then the last time he did it, and the time that he destroyed the city and the temple itself, a complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That occurred in around 586 or 587, and that's when the final group of captives went off into Babylon, were taken into Babylon. So it looks like at this point, at least from a human perspective, that there's nothing left. That the promise of God has failed, and people are, at least probably a lot of the people are very much dejected and depressed about this whole thing. But those who had listened to the prophets, and maybe because of all the punishment are now listening to the prophets, that is, after or during the captivity, that is, they could look to Isaiah and they could look to Jeremiah's prophecies and Ezekiel's prophecies, and they could see that in Isaiah, God speaks of a remnant, he calls it a tenth. If you look at Isaiah chapter 6, at the in this case, Isaiah sees a vision. He has a vision of heaven itself, and he sees everything he sees there, and the seraphim and the robe, the train of the robe of God filling the temple. And because he's in the presence of God himself, he realizes his own sinfulness. In verse 5, woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim fly to him with a burning coal in his hand, and he says, your sins are forgiven. And then, verse 8, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. So as one man has pointed out, when Isaiah gets his cleansing, he gets his commission. Well, the whole point of going through this is to say, what is his commission? Verse 9, go and tell this people, keep on listening but do not perceive, keep on looking but do not understand, render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull and their eyes dim, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. And Isaiah says in verse 11, how long am I supposed to do this? Lord, how long? And he answered, until cities are devastated and without inhabitant, houses are without people, and the land is utterly desolate. The Lord has removed men far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Yet, verse 13, there will be a tenth portion in it, and it will again be subject to burning like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. So right here in Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah is sent out to preach to the people, to tell them about what's coming, and ultimately to give one of the last calls of the people to come back to God. God says it's hopeless. They're going to be destroyed. They're going to be taken off into captivity, but there will be a tenth portion in it. There will be a small portion, a tenth of them. Whether that's an exact percentage or not, we don't know. This is in a poetic passage, so it could just be a round number, so to speak. But there's hope that is given after this message of desolation and destruction. And then several times throughout Isaiah, that message is repeated, that there will be a remnant that will return. In Jeremiah, we just mentioned a few minutes ago, the prophecy that Jeremiah gave concerning the 70 years of captivity. So what Jeremiah is saying, and he also speaks about the remnant that will return, but he's saying that after 70 years, the people will return, but only those who are a part of this remnant. And what we can say is that of the faithful people that are left after the captivity, these are the ones who will return. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't faithful people who were left or who decided to stay in Babylon and then later in Medo-Persia and so forth. But those who returned were faithful, because when you read in Ezra and Nehemiah, you see that the people who came with these two men at different times to return to Israel, to Judah and Jerusalem, they were very much involved and helpful to these men in rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. So, like I said, even though there is a complete destruction at the final moments of the crumbling of the kingdom, as they say here in the book, at the last paragraph of that section and the last sentence, it says, all they have now is the promise and the hope from the prophets of a future time of restoration and blessing ushered in by the coming Messiah. Now again, those promises and that hope from the prophets included a time of restoration and blessing that occurred in that time with the return of that remnant to Jerusalem and Judah. So this is partially fulfilled in that way. But as we know very clearly, in Isaiah, there are several passages, especially at the end of the book, chapters 40 through 66, that speak directly of the Messiah. There are several passages in the first part of the book. You have chapter 6 there. At the end may be a reference to the Messiah as well as the remnant, but there's definitely a reference to the Messiah in chapter 9 and chapter 11, I believe it is, where it talks about who that person will be and what he will be like. It doesn't name him other than the name Emmanuel, okay? But it does call him Mighty God, Eternal Father, So there's definitely a reference to the Messiah there. And that obviously is for a future time, which occurred in the first century when Jesus came. Now, Jeremiah also speaks of the future hope of restoration and so forth in Jeremiah 31, where he speaks of a new covenant that God would make with the house of Israel, and that's what we were referring to at the end of the last video, where we said that promise, that new covenant, is where God would dwell among his people. He would be their God, and they shall be his people, and he will remember their sins no more, and so forth and so on. And that again is a huge set of facts and ideas for this whole narrative, for this whole account of God's redemption of mankind. And let me just give you a kind of a preview of that. If you, when you take Biblical Worldview 2, obviously there's going to come a time, because we're just going to go through chapter 10 in this class. You're going to finish the book, and in chapter 20, when you deal with the book of Revelation, and I think again that is Revelation 2. No, the section that is covered there, I believe, is Revelation 19 through 22. Okay. My wife's trying to call me, so let me send her a message. So when you come to that 19 through 22, that section is going to be discussing what heaven is like, and so forth, and the final judgment, and going to heaven itself. But what I want to point out is let's just go back to Jeremiah 31. I didn't go there to begin with, but let's go to Jeremiah 31 and read that passage to you, or we can read it together, beginning with verse 31. Jeremiah 31, verse 31, it says, "Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after these days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more." Now, keep that in mind, and as you go through the New Testament, especially in the book of Hebrews, this same passage is quoted in the book of Hebrews to speak of the new covenant, that is the New Testament. The New Testament, the new covenant, saying the same thing in both phrases. But what's happening there is the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews quotes from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, to speak of the new covenant. okay? Because Jeremiah prophesies of the new covenant, and then the writer of Hebrews specifically quotes from Jeremiah and says this is the new covenant that is based on better promises, a better sacrifice, a better high priest, and so forth. And that's just kind of a note that that as you go through the book of Hebrews, if you ever read through the book of Hebrews, underline every time you see the word better. Okay, it's just kind of a study note for the book of Hebrews. Underline the word better, and you will see that the book of Hebrews is about how Jesus and his doings and his person and so forth is so much better than Moses and the law and so forth, and the sacrifices and the high priest of the law and so forth, that it makes it that the book of Hebrews is talking about the supremacy of Christ, how he is so much far better than what went before, and he has a better covenant. Okay, the New Testament, the New Covenant, is a better covenant than the old one. And otherwise, why would there be, if the first one was good enough to save us and get us to heaven, then there wouldn't have been a need for a new one. Okay, wouldn't have been a need for a second covenant. But getting back to Jeremiah 31, just keep this in mind as you go forward, and when you come to Hebrews, see how the writer of Hebrews uses it, as we've kind of detailed a little bit, but then go to Revelation, I believe it's 22, and well, I thought I had it. I know it's here somewhere. Must be in chapter 20. Okay, let's do this another way. Well, by the way, it's in Hebrews chapter 8 where the writer of Hebrews quotes from from Jeremiah 31. I just don't know. I could have pointed you to it. Any other time. In fact, I've got it highlighted in my own personal Bible. Well, Okay, Revelation 21, starting with verse 1. It says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no longer any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away." And then he says, and he who sits on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." So the whole idea of this passage it harkens back to Jeremiah 31, in that he talked about, I will be their God and be among them. Okay, in Jeremiah 31, but this also is a reference back to Ezekiel chapter 37, where he says in verse, he said, let's just start with verse 24. Ezekiel 37, verse 24, it says, "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. They will live on the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons forever, and their sons' sons forever. And David my servant will be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary is in their midst forever." So it's a combination in Revelation 21. It's a combination of Ezekiel 37 and Jeremiah 31. I would encourage you to study the book of Ezekiel and understand that these passages here do not speak of a literal kingdom that Jesus will come back and reign over in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. This is highly figurative language and so forth. But getting back to the original point, this whole idea of a new covenant spoken of first in Jeremiah 31 follows all the way through to heaven itself. And that is the final consummation, the final fulfillment, and the fullest fulfillment of the promise, "I will be their God, and they will be my people, and I will dwell among them, and I will forgive their sins," and so forth. That started to be fulfilled in Jesus coming to this earth and dying on the cross for our sins, but it will be finally and fully fulfilled in heaven itself. Okay, as I've said before, I'm going into a little bit more detail than I should be, so let's move on. Captivity and coming home. This part of the story, or this part of the narrative, I'm sorry, I keep going back to that word story that I don't like. At this point, after the 70 years are up, the 70 years that Jeremiah prophesied, this would be the first, the first captivity was taken in 605, so 70 years is 535, so the first people to return, or the first group to returned in 535 or thereabouts. And it was during this time that Daniel is in Babylon, and this is another side note that I meant to say something about earlier, and that is that when when Jeremiah is prophesying in Judah, in Jerusalem, Ezekiel is in Babylon prophesying to the people who are out away from, the palace and so forth, the actual captives that are living in Babylon and the surrounding areas. Ezekiel's out with them, trying to get them to understand what God is doing during this time of captivity. And then while Ezekiel's out there and Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, Daniel is in the royal court. He is dealing with national and international affairs directly with the king of Babylon and the kings of Babylon. He lived long enough to see several kings, and even down to the taking over of Babylon by the Medo-Persians. Okay, and therefore he served under Darius the Mede. Okay, and also Cyrus. But this, as they point out here in this paragraph, individuals like Daniel illustrate that faithfulness to God during the captivity is still possible. And again, Ezekiel is telling them the same thing. And Jeremiah is telling them the same thing, that you can still be faithful to God. And then, finally, after those 70 years are up, he says, after a time of living in exile away from the promised land, some of the remaining people return to Jerusalem and Judah under the leadership of men like Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, take into consideration that if 70 years have passed, the older people that go into captivity as older people, they don't make it through this, okay? They die in captivity. It's going to be the younger people, such as Daniel, who was just put it under the door, who was a youth when he went to Babylon. Just exactly how old he was, we're not exactly sure, but probably a young teenager. Could have been 14, 15, 16 years old. And, from his writings, we can tell that he was extremely mature at his age and, obeying God in everything that he did. So you have that illustration of faithfulness during captivity, as well as others. In Jeremiah's time, there is Baruch, his scribe, who remains faithful, although he kind of wavers there at some point, and God has to encourage him, and he does through Jeremiah. But that kind of thing is going on. But again, what I'm trying to say is that only the young people who go into captivity, probably in their teens or younger, maybe into their early 20s, can last through the whole 70 years. And in the case of Daniel, did last through the whole 70 years. But these are the people that were in their teens, maybe early 20s, and those born during the captivity who have never seen Israel, never seen Jerusalem. They come back, you might say, not back, but they come to Jerusalem for the first time. And this is when you come to Ezra and Nehemiah, especially, I think it's in Ezra, that when the young people see the foundation of the temple as it's being laid, or as it has finished being laid, they shout for joy, because the temple of God is beginning to be built. But the older people cry from sadness, because they were the ones who had witnessed Solomon's temple, the one that Solomon built and had lasted up until Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. Okay? They were the ones who had seen the magnificence of Solomon's temple, and therefore, or what is known as the first temple. And therefore, when they see this small foundation that's being built, this smaller temple, it's not going to be as grand, it's not going to be as beautiful, and so forth, they weep because they are so dejected over that particular fact. But all in all, even though, as they say here, they're a small, struggling, ragtag nation, still under foreign domination, that is, the Medo-Persians are still over them, okay, or the Persians. It's a long way away from the, as they put it, the wonderful time of restoration promised by the prophets. So this is not the restoration they're looking for. And therefore, as the Old Testament closes at this point with, letters like Daniel and Esther, even though they're not last in the book, last in the set of books, they are some of the last books that were written, okay? If not the last books that were written. So it's not what the prophets prophesied of, the situation they're in after their return, and therefore they, at least, again, some of them are dejected and depressed because of this. But what they don't understand is that the prophecies for a later time, for the first century, for the coming of the Christ, for the establishment of the kingdom, which is the church, and so forth, that is what the prophets are talking about. All right, this brings us then to Christ, and it's about 400 years after, Esther or Daniel, that God sends Jesus to this earth in the form of humanity, in the form of mankind, and he comes announcing good news, or the gospel of the kingdom, in fulfillment of God's covenant promises. Again, those, the restoration, the blessing that the people were looking for a long time. Even in the book of Hebrews, in chapter 11, let's just run over there and read that real quick. If you go to verse 39, after listing, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 39, after listing all these faithful people from Abraham and Moses and Noah and Joseph and, all these people, okay, that have been named here, he says in verse 39, and all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us, they would not be made perfect. That is to say, they were looking for the promises. In fact, if you go back to the early verses of the chapter, you go to the statement about Abraham in verse 8, he says, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So even Abraham was looking for heaven, okay? And in verse 16, after listing some of the, these people all the way down to Sarah, he then says in verse 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And then verse 16, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So, even as far back as Abraham, they were looking for the heavens, the eternal heaven that God has prepared at this point. Jesus said in John chapter 14, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So, again, these people died not having received the promise, but the promise or promises that God made in the prophets and all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 is fulfilled in Jesus. He begins with 12 disciples, 12 apostles, and other people, but his main group that he's trying to train and get ready for the coming days of the establishment of the church, establishment of the kingdom. He trains 12 men, and he's going to send them out to preach the gospel once he has ascended into heaven. Okay? And it says that Jesus teaches with authority and works miracles. It's John who says in John chapter 20, 30 and 31, many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that believing you might have life in his name. So the miracles, one of the purposes of the miracles was to prove that Jesus was and is deity. Okay? But for a while, the Jews, at least probably from the time that the Old Testament ends to the time that Jesus comes on the scene, is that period of what's called the intertestamental period between the testaments. There is a period of silence where God has not sent or revealed anything during that close to 400 years, again, since the closing of the Old Testament. And it's during that time that this idea develops that the Messiah is going to be a literal king who's going to come to earth. He's going to reign. He's going to renew the Davidic kingdom. He's going to renew the kingdom of David and expand the borders of Israel to the places where David had taken it. And the Messiah is going to raise up an army, and he's going to he's going to throw out all these people who have dominated Israel for so long. In this case, in the time of the Messiah, in time of Jesus, it would be the Romans. Okay? Because, like I said, when Babylon took them off into captivity, then the Medo-Persians took over from Babylon, and then the Greeks came after the Medo-Persians, and now the Romans are in power in the first century and have been for the past 200 or 300 years. But the Jewish people developed this concept that Jesus was going to come and, or the Messiah was going to come and be a military leader and a physical king and on a physical throne. But they were mistaken. They did not understand the prophets. They did not understand the Old Testament, again, going all the way back to Genesis 3. They didn't understand those things. They didn't do their homework, so to speak. They didn't study like they should have and understand what God was saying throughout all that time. Because it gets to a point in the first century where the Jews, even the apostles, are thinking that this is still a physical kingdom, because just before Jesus ascends back into heaven, in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, it says, so when they had come together, they were asking him, this is the 12 or the 11 at this point, because Judas has fallen away and killed himself. But the 11 are with him at this point, and says when they had come together, they were asking him, Lord, is it at this time that you're restoring the kingdom of Israel? They've been with him for 3.5 years, and they still think that the kingdom is going to be physical. And then he goes on to say, no, you don't know everything at this point, and then the Holy Spirit's going to come, and he's going to, as he said back in John 14, 15, and 16, he's going to guide you into all truth. He's going to remind you of what I've taught you, and then he's going to tell you further things that I have not told you. So what happens is the kingdom that Jesus is to set up is a spiritual kingdom. It is the church. And therefore, as they point out here in this paragraph, he saves people from their sins not by leading a military revolution, but by dying on the cross and being raised from the dead. And this is God's plan to rescue his people and restore creation. Now, we're going to get into that if I ever teach Biblical Worldview 2. We'll get into that, restoring creation, in that time. But with the coming of Jesus, the story of God, the account of God will fix the world, of how God will fix the world, reaches its climax. Okay, I would say that would be with the crucifixion and the fact that Jesus is raised from the dead. That would be the climax. And his ascension into heaven, sitting down at the right hand of God, is the final thing that is the pinnacle of everything that God has said and done up to this point. And the only other enemy to be defeated, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, is death itself, and that will be defeated at the final resurrection. But Christ comes on the scene, and he brings about, he fulfills everything that God had said up to that point concerning him and the kingdom and the church. Okay, we'll pick up in video 4, session 4, with the next paragraph, the church, and then we'll move on into chapter 1, hopefully in that video also. So as always, I'm here to help, and feel free to call on me. You have a great day.